to the next scheduled item and welcome our two other speakers, because this is going to be like a developer advocate power meeting. Because as a second developer advocate, let's welcome Tania Allard. She was already talking today, and she's a senior developer advocate at Microsoft. And let's see, can I add her to the screen? Yep. Hey.
Hello.
So I have you on the screen. You did this great talk about getting started with JupyterLab extensions. So I love JupyterLab, and I'm looking forward to being able to do my own extensions as well at some point. So let's see how that works out. I will follow that and watch it again to see that I understand everything. And as a third person for today, we have another developer advocate, and that's our own Lais. Carvalho. She is a newbie developer advocate. She's a final year IT student. Her background is on civil and environment engineering. She's a board member at Python Ireland, who are helping us with this conference. And she was part of the organization of EuroPython and PyData Data Dublin. So let's welcome our presenter as a panelist. Hey.
Hello.
And there she is.
Hello there. Can you hear me? Is everything okay?
Yep, yeah, I think we can hear you all. And Lais, you're gonna host this panel, so go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for the introduction as well. Hello, Mark. Hello, Tania. It's awesome to have you here.
Hi, Lais. Great to see you.
Hi.
Great to see you too. I speak to you a lot on Twitter, both of you. So it's good to finally put a face on the name and hear your voices as well. It's really good. Cool. So for everyone that is watching us, we have a channel. If you have questions, if you're in Discord and you'd like to post your questions, we have a channel on discussions called Developer Advocacy. You're welcome to go there and leave your questions and tag Tania and Mark as well. So with no further ado, let's start then. So this is a deep dive into the Python community discussion panel. So I'm going to start then asking you, since you're both very engaged on the Python community, I would like to start asking, how did your Python journey start?
Who should go first?
I'll let Mark go first for this one.
I know, I'm old. It's going to go on for ages. I was originally a Java programmer. So I went to university to study computer science. I found it incredibly tedious, and the dot-com boom started sort of in the mid to late 90s. And so I dropped out of university and then tried to get a job, which was harder than I expected. I mean, I was pretty naive at the time. Eventually found myself a job, and it helps a lot when you've got your first job to get a second job. But yeah, this was all Java programming. And then I started working for a company in London called eStreet, which was actually the biggest website in London for a while. And there was a lot of data management. And Java is not great for writing scripts to sort of manipulate data. And so I taught myself Perl. And Perl was great. I mean, it was just amazing. I hadn't realized it could be so easy to just kind of open up files, rip data apart, put it back together in different ways, and then load it up into a database. But over time, that code can become quite difficult to maintain. I mean, that is nowadays Perl's real reputation. It's slightly crazy, and your code can only be read once. So I started looking around for another language. I found Ruby. Unfortunately, Ruby at the time only had one book in the English language that was Ruby in a Nutshell by O'Reilly, and everything else was in Japanese, and I didn't read Japanese. And also it was really slow. It was actually great. I kind of preferred it at the time to Python. I had a quick look at Python, seen it had significant indentation, and then thought, no, I'm going back to another language. But because Ruby was so slow, I gave Python another look, and I've never really looked back. Like, it was just incredible. I after one day of using it, I didn't care about the significant indentation anymore. And this was back in 2000. Over the last 20 years, the amount of libraries out there to make it easy to use stuff, like even everything from database drivers to file formats to Jupyter, for example, it's the best glue language that there is. So yeah, that's how I. Oh, but I didn't get a job doing Python really until about 10 years ago, because there weren't any jobs doing Python until about 10 years ago. And I realized that you talked about the community. It's like, I realized that if I was going to contract as a Python developer, I needed to be able to find new contracts, and there was no real Python community in Edinburgh. So I set up the Python Edinburgh user group, just so I could meet other Python developers, just as an opportunity to get more work. And that totally changed my life, really, in terms of, like, especially the move to developer advocacy, which I guess we'll be talking about for later on in this talk. Yeah, so Python and the community thing sort of really went together as a career, just naturally.
Yeah, it is the best part of the Python community. Of Python is the community.
Absolutely.
Cool. And Tania, how was it for you?
Yeah, well, I didn't come from a computer science background. I'm actually a mechatronics engineer from formation, which is like a mixture of all the engineering there. So like mechanics, mechanical engineering, electronics, automation, computer science, and like everything together. But I started doing a lot of, back then we were using a lot of MATLAB, C. I even learned like assembly. It was, it's not my favorite, but it did open up like a new world of things that I could start doing with microprocessors and like assembling stuff. But then I just carried on doing a lot of automation. I got very interested in like optimization, which is like a weird like thing to be interested in. And then when I was doing my PhD, a lot of my work was still like on MATLAB, Fortran. I did a lot of coding in Fortran. And I'm gonna say modern Fortran is actually nice. It's actually good. But then I eventually I think it was like during my PhD that I just bumped into the scientific Python ecosystem, and all of these amazing libraries. It was fascinating to me, like being able to have everything automated, like all my data analysis, generate all my outputs, like all my plots, and then be able to just like link that to my LaTeX PhD thesis. Like I just became like an automation nerd. Like as soon as I would upload new data, generate like the whole new analysis, all the outputs, recompile my thesis, have like an up-to-date version of that. And like the same with my papers. So that was basically how I fell in love with the scientific Python ecosystem. And also because something that I was lacking during my PhD was a sense of community, because I was the one in my lab doing computational work. A lot of like my other lab peers were mostly doing experimental work, but mine was much more on the optimization and modeling side of things. So I came up, I just found the software carpentry folks, joined that community, and then realized that there was like a whole Python community out there. So I just started joining meetups, user groups, going to conferences, talking to just like random Pythonistas on Twitter. And since then, I've never looked back. And I think one of the reason why is because I did feel like I belonged, although I was doing like scientific stuff and doing like PhD using Python. I found like people that were like, oh yeah, that's actually cool, then like willing to help me. And that is something that I never had in my PhD, because I was the weird one doing other stuff. Yeah, and since then I've been involved in the Python community in so many different ways, many different levels within the UK and like globally as well. Yeah, I think that's how I came to be part of the Python community.
That's awesome. Yeah, like I feel the absolute same. It's like it's a permission to be the weirdo in the room, and no one is judgmental about it. So like you have authorization to spend, I don't know, a week just having a look at some Dunder methods, and then just come up with like, look what I found, and then you can make a talk out of it.
That's very much my experience.
That was my life last week, so I kind of understand it. Cool. Thank you very much for your answers.
The thing I love about the Python community is you can reach out to some of the most senior people in this community, the absolute core of the core Python team, and ask them questions, sometimes dumb questions, and they will usually find time to help you. And I always try to pay that back. If people contact me with questions, even if they're not my speciality, it's like, if I can't solve it, then maybe I can put people in touch with somebody else that can. It's like, it's important to pass that on.
Yes, helping other people build their network as well, because that's how they learn, and we kind of learn with that as well. Yeah, that's awesome. Now, what's the hardest thing you've ever done on Python?
Oh, what's the hardest thing I've ever done in Python?
Mhm.
I don't know if it's the hardest thing in Python, but it's like converting an inner source project into open source, and it's like a whole it's a Python project that is held, well, it's all on medical imaging processing and using deep learning to do predictions based on, for example, CT scans or MRIs. I think the most challenging was like making that shift from inner source to open source, and convince folks and work with the team that it was worth making it like right from the start, making sure that it was inclusive for other folks in the community to start jumping in and contributing and raising issues. We had a lot of talks like, our documentation is not excellent, our documentation is far from perfect, so we're just gonna wait until it's better. It's like, no, put it out there. Because one of the nicest things of the Python community is like their willingness to help each other. So of course they're gonna go and look at our documentation, and they're gonna say like, this is far from complete, or like far from good. But they all help us find those holes and even fix them. And it's a pretty heavy package. Like technically, and doing the technical work together, doing the technical work of it is really, really hard. But for me, that was the hardest part, playing the open source advocate when moving from inner source.
Making it accessible was the hardest part. Okay, yeah, and best practice as well. And well, documentation.
It's a repeated thing, isn't it? That internal code is always worse than the stuff you publish as open source. I mean, I've learned so much for the way you package projects and document projects from the open source community, and then tried to bring it internally. And, you know, I mean, it takes so much time. It's difficult to justify it when you've got a limited number of developers or whatever. But yeah, that's the opposite thing. But I don't know that I have. It's really difficult. Like, every Python project I've ever worked on has been challenging in its own way, and I think kind of user interfaces and user experience is probably the hardest bit, just of the apps that I've built from a technical perspective. But the thing that I can't get my head away from at the moment, so I can't give you a good answer for this, is I've got a stupid answer, which is I did this lightning talk 5 years ago. That I've just given a talk based, just like half an hour ago, given a talk based on that lightning talk from 5 years ago, and I've had a sequel in my head for 5 years that I've been gradually working on. It's only going to be a page of code, but it's a page of code that basically is changes to the Python language that make it look like Java, but it has to execute in Python. It's like a bunch of sort of clever tricks in Python code. And it's so difficult that I've been kind of working at this. Like, I've got 3 major pieces to it, and I want to make it validate the types as they go in and out of functions and things, and that's kind of fine. There's already libraries out there that will do that. I want to get rid of the self variable when you call a method or implement a method, and I've got a way to do that as well, and private methods and things like that. Just implementing a whole load of things that Java developers expect to have in Python, that I expected to have when I learned Python. And it's really fun, and it's, yeah, as I say, it's not a lot of code, but it's a lot of learning to get these things working. And I think one day I might be able to actually give this SQL lightning talk sort of that's really stupid.
We're looking forward for that. I am really looking forward to that, because like I've tried my first proper Python application that wasn't even proper. It was a college assignment. I was trying to get, I learned Java beforehand. So the assignment was build this application and make sure you use design patterns. So I was trying to use design patterns in Python, but with a background in Java.
And a lot of them don't make sense in Python, do they? I did exactly the same thing. As I would open up an empty Python file and implement a class from like the first thing that I would do, because that was just what I was used to. It took me, I think, probably 5 years until I was really writing what I now consider to be Pythonic code. It's an ongoing. It's not easy, you know. It's an ongoing learning process to learn how to take advantage of a new language.
Yeah, I'm 1 year too, so I'll tell you when I get there.
You'll get there.
Eventually, yes. So what about when you're trying to so that I'm gonna go for Tania with this one. So Tania, when you're trying to develop that application and putting through open source and like being the open source developer, the open source advocate for the project, did you get a lot of help from the community? Or like, did you get a lot of help from the Python people you know that were not necessarily from the community? How did you make that work?
Yeah, definitely. So I have experience contributing to and maintaining open source packages, but a lot of that experience has come from mentoring from others, just like getting other folks that have been walking me through on how to make my project more inclusive, more accessible, friendlier, and like more approachable to folks. But also, I think this is the first time that I actually tried to do something that was inner source and then make it open source. So there were a lot of nuances and even just like basic licensing questions. I would say basic, or just like some implications of going from inner source to open source that I was not aware. So it's just reaching out to other folks that I knew that had done something similar or had experience working in like company, like industry-led or corporate-led open source, to see how they go about it, what's their best practices, how do they encourage people from their own company, not only to contribute to just the company's open source projects, but further down into the open source community as a whole. So yeah, I think, it's always been my experience that folks are very, very willing to help and very willing to share their experiences, or pointing you to the right person as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And now I have a few questions from the audience, but before I go to the questions from the audience, I want to ask you another question. There's actually my question. How do you folks contribute to open source, having like a full-time job? And so do you get does MongoDB or Microsoft help you, give any kind of support for you to contribute to open source? How does that work, being a developer advocate as well?
Who is that aimed at?
Let's start with Mark this time. Sorry. Hang of this.
So I don't contribute very much to open source, if I'm being honest. Everything I develop for work is pretty much open source. If I'm developing tools on top of, for example, MongoDB, those would usually be published as open source. I consider like my contribution to the community to be mostly through kind of education and documentation. So the talks that I give, maybe the last one I gave just isn't a very good example, but normally I give talks about kind of how classes or functions or meta classes work in Python and things like that. And those are all essentially sponsored by the company. You know, I'm allowed to give talks that aren't about MongoDB at Python conferences, because that's just, I mean, it's good for the company in terms of awareness of us being good people and having good people working for us. But in other terms, I have a kid and some pets and hobbies, so I don't actually have that much time to properly dedicate to submitting code to open source projects, unless it's kind of a bug fix or something like that, because I feel like there's a commitment there when you commit code to an open source project, to, as well as submitting it, it's got to be maintained, right? And I think you're kind of giving a little bit of yourself to that project, which it's absolutely incredible. I really appreciate the people who can do that, but I don't really have the spare space for it.
Cool. And then Tania, how do you do it?
So I think on one side it's very similar to Mark's experience, where like educational content, outreach content, like speaking at different conferences, working on, I don't know, podcasts or Twitch streams, those fall within the remit of my core job as a developer advocate. But I still kind of can justify doing some open source contributions, in the sense, not always code, but for example, I sit in the global council for PyLadies, and that also helps with the community. I have some initiatives that I'm trying to work on with Microsoft as a partner, so that like sits in both my roles as well. And then I do a lot of, I organize mentor sprints, which I've paused for a while now because I didn't have time, and it's coming to the holidays and stuff. But I try to balance whenever I have time, because I also have hobbies. I also have a dog, and my dog is a lot of work. But I try to balance whenever I feel like I'm burned out, like burning out, or I'm so tired, or I just feel like doing something that makes me happy outside open source. I listen to myself and then just take that time to myself. If I feel like I have all the spoons and like resources, and I can dedicate times and days to mentor others, or be involved in governance, or organizing community things, or contributing code, I just like fit that into spare hours that I find throughout the week or weekends.
Okay, perfect. Well, it's been working. I know you're very, very active in the community, so thank you as well. Thank you for your hard work. Now let's jump into questions from the audience. So Martin, hello Martin. Not the one that introduced us, another one that is also on EuroPython. So he is asking, how do you keep local Python communities together during this special time now? So there are so many online events. Does it make sense to add even more events to it? Let's start with that. Whoever wants to start, come on.
Okay, I'm unmuted, so I'll go. I think we're so lucky in a way that this is happening now rather than 10 years ago when video conferencing didn't really work. We actually still can keep these communities alive rather than everybody being completely isolated. And I think, as I say, I run the Edinburgh Python user group, not very efficiently at the best of times. And we haven't met up since everything went virtual, partly just because it's very difficult to be motivated to do anything when we're all kind of stuck in our homes. But I do plan to run an event just to get that group of people together at some point in the near future, so that they can kind of see what each other is up to before we eventually, hopefully, get the chance to go back to being in person again. But I think the thing that's really important to remember is these video conferences are actually much more accessible than what we had before. The idea of running an Edinburgh user group was simply because people from Edinburgh can't travel to London to go to the London user group every month. Whereas we can run an online user group here for everyone in our time zone and the time zones around it, and this has been amazing for people, for example, in Africa, who are able to attend events that they've never been able to attend before. I hadn't initially thought about it until some of the people I follow on Twitter from that community are like, this is the first time I'm going to get to go to EuroPython. This is the first time I'm going to get to go to this conference, because the price of flights is untenable, whereas some internet access for a few hours is okay. So it's not so much that we have more or less opportunity now, or rather, it's not that we should have more events. It's just that we should open those events wider, I think, to incorporate some people that maybe weren't included before.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think I've been very, very conscious, especially as the year is coming to an end. I've been very, very conscious that also folks are coming to video conference or video call fatigue. I personally feel super fatigued. I don't know what it is about. But you like being constantly on calls all time, and then video conference, like having a whole 4-day conference all online. It's just so much more exhausting than if I were there. Even though when I'm like in person, I spend so much time talking to people, running from one place to another, drinking insane amounts of coffee. Probably it's the coffee. Probably I need more coffee. That's it. But I think it has been very interesting to see how shifting from in-person to online has made all of these conferences much more accessible. So I said, I've been very, very aware and conscious of not adding more, because also a lot of folks have been having to educate kids at school. They've had, like, people are sharing the same room. Sometimes people are working from the kitchen table or the floor or whatever. So although they're also more accessible, we also have a complete chaotic living arrangement at the time. So I've been trying to be very, very mindful and not overburden neither my community organizers or my community. I think.
Wow, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I do have the feeling that although we are being more inclusive, the events are more diverse. Well, pajamas was initially thought as that, so we're gonna be able to get people from all over the world, and the idea came way before COVID actually got here. There was the idea of uniting everyone around the world, and be able to like create this atmosphere where everyone just loves Python and we're able to share stuff, and we're able to meet as well. But COVID got here before we did, but it's fine. We're here now. Honey in the Developer Adequacy channel actually has 3 questions. I'm going to start with the most obvious one. And I would love if Tania could start with this, could start answering this one. So actually, what is a developer advocate? What are the roles and the technical responsibilities? And how can a person be skilled to that career level?
Ooh. That is a deeply philosophical question, because I think developer advocate or developer advocacy also changes a lot depending on where you're being a developer advocate, and where within the organization you sit. For example, I sit within engineering, but I know other folks that are developer advocates and they fall in marketing. So the responsibilities and like how they measure success and impact is very different to the way we do it in engineering. So I would say that my role is advocating on behalf of my community and my users, not advocating on behalf of my company, but I'm trying to understand what my users are doing, what the bloggers are doing, how we are serving them or how we're not serving them. And then help them with all of that experience. Some of that is working very, very closely with our engineering teams on product roadmaps, implementing new features, all based on customer or community feedback, understanding what tools we should prioritize or what programming languages we should prioritize to provide better support. Another big component is writing educational content, either touching Azure products or just pure Python or data science or machine learning. And then another part of that is like actual technical work, taking issues, working on demos. I do a lot of dogfooding, which is whenever we are releasing a new tool or a new feature or like a big version of a product, I do a lot of testing, compare with other tools that are out there to do something similar, then report back to engineering teams, work on scorecarding, fixing bugs, and then rinse and repeat. So it's very technical, but still a lot of that is on communication, like communicating with people, communicating with my communities, communicating with my engineering teams, even with the marketing teams when we're, for example, sponsoring conferences, making sure that we're not just giving money or slapping our logo in a conference, but actually bringing something to the community, making sure that we understand the community, that we have, I don't know, tutorials or talks that are relevant to them, enhancing enhancing our presence and the value that we bring to the conference as much as possible.
I'd add to not add. I agree with everything that Tania says. That is, and it's so much clearer than the way I would have fumbled my way through answering that question. The thing I really liked about the way you answered that question was you started off with essentially you're the one that understands your users and kind of feeds that back internally. I think many people think of developer advocacy as being a thing that's outward facing. Hey, I build toy projects and I try and make them go viral, or I write blog posts and stuff like that. Whereas at the very least, half the role is really to be the user or to talk to the users and feed that information back internally. And that's actually made the job really, really difficult this year, because in the past I used to go to these conferences and drink too much coffee and talk to people who either wanted to use MongoDB or are using MongoDB or don't want to use MongoDB, and find out why and what they're having trouble with, and things they might want to do. And then feed that back internally, or just build that in as something that we understand internally. And it's very difficult to just have those conversations with, random people at the moment. I can schedule talks with people if I know them, but you don't get that serendipity that you get when you're at a conference or something like that. It's making the job really hard.
The trips as well, right? The traveling part of the job, that also changed a lot with COVID.
Oh, that bit's easier.
Yes, jet lag is the one thing I don't miss.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Like I was reading, someone was saying one of these days that like the whole thing about the three pillars of developer advocacy seem to be is the three C's. So it's code, content, and community. And then as long as we can figure out a way of contributing to those three core pillars, then we're on a good track. And then adding to that is the communication as well. That is not really trivial. It's not really fundamental it's discussable, but apparently it's not really fundamental as a developer advocate, but it helps a lot. So
I love how wide-ranging the role is, because I started as an engineer, but now I have to know a little bit of marketing, sales, support. It's such a wide-ranging role, and so it's very difficult to get bored because there's so much to it. Of course, the flip side is it's very easy to get burned out because there's just so much stuff going on at the same time. So but if you like people and you're a developer and you like communication, then it's an absolutely fantastic role.
Yeah, and also I have to add here, you don't have to be an extroverted to be a developer advocate. Also, there is so many ways in which you can reach out to communities and folks out there, and you just need to find the content strategies that work for you. I know some folks are like written content machines. For example, in my team, I have a colleague, and he just creates like blog posts and tutorials like left to right all day, all year long. But that is a workflow that doesn't work for me. I tend to change and vary the kind of content that I produce depending on how I feel and what I'm working on. But also when it comes to the public perception of developer advocacy, I think a lot of folks think, oh, well, they just travel around, they just spend the time talking to people, drinking insane amounts of coffee, and it's so glamorous. But I think those are the smallest portions of a developer advocate role. They're probably the most visible, but I would say that is, 20 to 30% of the actual role, and it's definitely not the hardest.
Except for the jet lag.
Yeah, except for the jet lag. But jet lag is probably, you can sometimes trick jet lag. I remember one time that I was on Twitter and GitHub. It must have been I don't know what time it was. 4 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, but I was so awake. I was in Americas. So I was just working. And someone was like, isn't it ridiculous early where you are? Yeah, but my body doesn't know that. So I'll just make the most of this time.
That sounds something we can all relate to. Absolutely. Working in the middle of the night. And do you have any suggestions maybe, or any tips for someone that is studying and would like to become a developer advocate? Letting you decide the order. I'm not doing this. Go for it.
I find that a really difficult question to answer because I kind of fell into developer advocacy. There was a job post on a Scottish mailing list from somebody who'd really tried to hire an advocate and really struggled to get any decent candidates at all. Apparently I was that person, which was a surprise to me. And they listed, it was a terrible job out of it. They listed so many things that they required in the list. And it said at the top, any of these, we don't want all of them, but I did have all of them, like every single one in this sort of 20-item bullet list. And so I just sort of had to apply for the role. It was everything I enjoy doing. But having said that, everybody comes to it from a different place, right? As Tania said, there are people who don't like public speaking, and there are still advocacy roles for them. Everyone in my team has a different speciality, just naturally. There are some people who love video. There's one guy who's actually a TikTok star. There's people who like writing. And then there's the community people, the people who just live for helping people get answers to their problems or introducing them to other people or starting up meetup groups and whatever. And we have specialisms for all of those places. So it's really, if you think you overlap in any way with that role of advocacy, of being a user and feeding that back internally or representing the company to developers outside, then, there's probably a good fit there. The difficulty is when it comes to finding the right company to work for, like the company that's actually doing something that you care about, like essentially promoting or making better as a product. And so, it can take a while. And I know some people who come from it from not a huge amount of engineering experience either. There are very experienced engineers. And then there are people who have come straight out of a boot camp successfully into advocacy roles. There's no fixed route into this. It's more like if you want to do it, find some advocates, especially ones you admire or you think have a similar skill set to yourself, and talk to them about how they got into it, and maybe get some recommendations as well, because it's not actually a big discipline. There's not that many people doing it, and so everybody knows everybody. Sorry, it was a bit rambling, but that was my answer.
Okay, so it's basically apply and find a mentor.
Yes.
Cool.
Good. God, you're so good at this. The 3 C's, and now just summarizing my waffle into 2 words.
that is like Lais' superpower, just like concise summarizing all of our rambling.
Come on.
It is like perfect communicate. Like it's a perfect communication skill as well. So yeah, you're there. But yeah, I think a lot is also understanding why you want to do developer advocacy. Like having a deep understanding on what of developer advocacy actually drives you to that. For me, I don't know. Like I don't think I ever had the thought, I want to become a developer advocate. It just fell into, I started seeing these folks like developer advocates at conferences and places. I got to talk to a couple of them. Like, so what do you do? And it's like, oh yeah, that sounds like something I could do. I like coding. I like community. I like organizing stuff. I wear way too many hats at all time. That sounds like it's something I could do. And it just so happened, actually, it was on Twitter. I found that Microsoft was hiring developer advocates in the UK, and it's like, oh yeah, I'll just give it a shot and see what's going. But I already knew also developer advocates at Microsoft. So I was also well aware of what they were doing, what the focus of advocacy was. So I was kind of in the safe route there as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your thoughts on developer advocacy. I think we should switch a little bit more right now because we're having a few questions about, C. Someone mentioned C, so there is always C Python in the middle, of the questions. Then there is a few people asking as well about advice for starting with Python. So let's jump right super quick into that. So Honey is also saying that he loves the simplicity and human readability of Python when it comes to system programming. Regarding the deterministic nature of Python, you read somewhere that Python is not much popular for doing deterministic tasks like C. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm assuming, given Honey's embedded software backgrounds, that this is a question really about MicroPython and CircuitPython and the way they behave. So it's true that it's not as deterministic. It's because it runs in a virtual machine with some sort of garbage collector, and so you can't necessarily predict its exact behavior. But the thing you have to ask yourself is, does that matter to you? It's going to take a lot longer to write that software in C, and if you're prototyping, or if you just don't care about the deterministic behavior of your code running on a microcontroller, then actually that's probably not a problem for you. There's lots of projects out there now where the chips are being programmed in MicroPython and then being produced commercially and distributed. It's not a toy language for embedded programming. So it's about whether it matches your needs, not necessarily. It's not a be all and end all. It's not like this is the only way to do it. Is this the right way to do it for you?
Cool. Thank you. And Tania, would you like to comment on that, or are you good?
No, I am good. I think that was a very nice response by Marek.
I'm just hoping I'm answering the right question.
Well, Honey, if it is not, no, not really. Embedded systems have multi-core systems now. He works in 4-core, but I'm not sure. I think maybe you should just have a chat, Mark and Honey, on Discord later on. So I think we can have some
let's do that.
Yes.
And we can bring in the CircuitPython folks as well.
And Tania, there's also people saying that they would love to be part of the mentored sprints.
Yes.
Yes.
Join the mentored sprints.
Yes. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, actually?
Yeah. So I started mentored sprints because I've been to a lot of conferences, and it's very common in the Python community that after the core conference days, there is a developer sprint. So folks just stay around for a couple more days, contribute to open source projects. But it's also a very good opportunity for maintainers to get together and discuss projects. But when you are brand new to contributing to open source or never had a chance to do it, or even if you're very new to the Python community, sometimes it's very hard to justify having an extra 2 or 3 days after a conference to your employer, or even to afford like extra accommodation or stuff. So it all started about, I was thinking how we can make these sprints more accessible and more suitable for beginners. So I started running them during the core days of conferences. And because maintainers and frequent contributors to projects were already attending the conferences, it was a good way to get folks that were already experienced with the projects, with the language, to come in, share some of their expertise, and mentor folks, like have mentored contributions, like live 1-to-1 or 5-to-1 guided contributions. So they not only learned more about the code base and the development experience and the contributing experience, but actually had a supporting environment that would help them to make meaningful contributions. And I also wanted to kind of demystify, or change the perception that the most important contribution you can make to an open source project is code. So whenever I talk to the projects that are interested in being involved in mentor sprints, I do highlight that they have to bring a wide range of issues or tasks to work in. Not everything has to be code. We've had folks that were asking for a tutorial to be written. We had folks from CircuitPython when we were doing in-person events, and they brought little items, and people were just having a blast trying these new products or trying the new library or tutorials. We've also had some folks that wanted design-specific stuff or UX advice. So we've had just all sorts of contributions. And the idea is that we're going to give beginners that have never had the opportunity to contribute to open source, to have a mentor, to get started in the world, familiarize with the project, And then we also provide support to those mentors on and advice on how to make their project much more accessible for new contributors as well.
Thank you. And do you have any plans? Do you know when the next edition is going to happen, or if it's going to be in person or online?
So the last mentor sprints have been online. And I want to continue doing that online. Actually, we were working on a community handbook on how to run your own virtual mentor sprints. That's open source and anyone can contribute to that. And I hope that in January, we're going to resume. We had plans for November, but that just went out the window. So January, we'll have more online mentored sprints.
Perfect. Thank you. Then let me ask you. So I'm going to ask Mark this time then. So Mark, since you started with Java and then you jumped into Python, what were the best, like the best ways to learn Python? And is there any projects you recommend for people there for folks they're like starting now, or they want to learn a little bit more? And then Tania, if you want to compliment anything on that, please feel free. Okay.
Obviously, it was quite a long time ago that I learned. It was difficult at the time because Python 2 had just been released and all the books were for Python 1. So I had to kind of translate what was in the book into what actually worked in the modern Python interpreter. I learned from Learn Python, which is a much thicker book these days. And I don't know if the new edition's any good. If I'm being honest, there are a lot of books out there that are really good. It depends on your learning style, right? I really like to read books. I don't particularly like watching videos to learn stuff, which is ironic given that that's part of my job, to go to conferences and speak. But I think the second part of your question is the most important thing, like that you have to have a project. You can't just read a book. You have to be building something. And it doesn't have to be original. It probably shouldn't be a to-do list because that doesn't actually teach you very much about what you're learning. But try and find, especially if you want to do web development, find a site that you like, whether it's, I don't know, Facebook, Instagram, something like Trello, and try and build something similar to that. It doesn't have to be like hugely complex to start off with, but you'll find that as you solve the initial problems, like just to get something working, you'll start to find new problems that need to be solved until you've got something quite rich. They can be toy projects over a long period of time if you want to, if that's something that keeps you going. But if you can also find a project that, I mean, potentially might make you money. It's worked out for my wife when she was learning to program, in that she found a dance studio that needed a booking site, and so she built one, and that's still being maintained 6 years later, like very much maintained, whole new versions being released with whole new features, and it involved kind of integration with payment systems and things like that are totally non-trivial, and unless you won't attempt the difficult stuff unless it kind of comes into your path. So attempting something kind of non-trivial is, I think it's a good way to learn.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've tried in the past going through like learning from books or blog posts or tutorials. But I've always found that I learned the most by doing, like learning with a purpose. When I was doing my PhD, of course, my ultimate goal was getting my analysis done and have a reproducible, automated PhD thesis. So I had to find a way to achieve that. That was my ultimate goal. That was the purpose of me learning Python. So I'd say, like, find why you want to, what you want to do with Python. There are so many things that you can do. But I still, whenever I need to learn something quick, I still go to sites like Real Python. I do a lot of just like quick Google Foo or Foo. I look at a lot of work that other developer advocates do as well. So like, oh, they have like this approach, like to building this app. I'm like, oh, what about we do it like this other way, or like build things using another approach. So that's also very helpful, looking at how others are writing code and are doing things.
I guess that's the other thing. If you can find a network of other beginners, and hopefully like more advanced people as well, but especially other people struggling with learning, you can solve each other's problems and just support each other in that learning process. I think that's important too.
Discord, the Python Discord helped me a lot on the beginning, because not only they can help you with questions with the bots, but there's also a beginners channel where you can ask your stupid questions and not really be that afraid of not getting an answer. Perfect. Now, well, we all know that you are both amazing speakers. We love your talks. Yes. Okay. Oh no, actually, before that, I have a comment, because David Jones is saying on the comments that he still has a soft spot for Python 1.5.2. And yeah, I knew you would like that.
It was much smaller, like as a language and core library. There was less to learn, which was quite nice.
Oh.
Okay.
I have to admit, I never used Python 1 point anything.
To be honest, most people haven't. When you think about how much it's grown over the last 2 decades, it's like, there's only a tiny fraction of people who have ever touched Python 1.
And people move. Sorry, go ahead.
People moved to Python 2 very willingly. It was much less difficult to get people to move to Python 2 than it was to 3, even though there were some breaking changes in there. And that's just because it was much better in almost every way.
That, like when I started asking my question and you said, "Oh, I learned a long time ago," I was like, "Oh, you're not that old." And then you're like, "Yeah, so I learned with Python 1." I was like, "Okay."
It's fine. You are that old. I've got the filter on and everything. It's
okay. And now I know the secret. Okay, I need a few of those actually. Anyway. Cool. So yes, going back to the fact that you're great speakers, how does one pick up that skill? I'm going to start with Tania this time.
Practice. There is no other way than just like practicing and practicing and practicing. If you want to become, I don't know, like an international conference speaker, the best places to start practicing are meetups, because they're small scale, people are super friendly, they're usually like quite informal. I still sometimes use meetups to do initial runs of new talks or talks on new topics that I'm not like, oh, I'm a master in this. And I always get like incredible feedback or questions that make my presentation and my delivery better. But yeah, I think you only get better by practicing.
The only thing I want to add something to that, which is that it's not just practice by going and giving talks more often. It's also, before you give each talk, rehearse a few times. It's something for some bizarre reason. When I first started doing public speaking, I wouldn't rehearse. Like, I would read through my notes and everything beforehand, but I wouldn't actually stand up and speak for example, in front of a mirror or in front of Zoom or something before actually giving the talk live the first time. Nowadays, it's probably an average of about 5 rehearsals before I'll actually give a talk in front of other people. And it sounds like a lot. Like I've given this advice to people before, and they're like, 5 times. Wow, that's impressive. But it isn't. It's if it's a half an hour talk, that's 2.5 hours work. That's half an afternoon. It usually takes a little bit longer because you have to go back through and revise slides and notes and things the first couple of times. But it's just that keep doing it until you feel comfortable. And then when you're in front of Zoom or whatever, your nerves will be much less because you just kind of know what you're doing. You don't have to think about it so much.
Yep.
But yeah, rehearsal, practice, absolutely. That's the only thing.
Yeah. And I also want to add like a point that it's not probably on the delivery, but a lot of folks are a bit intimidated about talking about a topic that they don't feel like they master or are experts in. That doesn't matter. That absolutely doesn't matter. A lot of my talks are inspired by problems or barriers that I faced when trying to do something or learning something. And how I actually overcame those barriers or helping others to overcome those barriers. So that doesn't mean that you have to be an expert. I think that if I had waited to be an expert in anything, I would have never given a talk. Never.
if you've only just learned something, you're currently the best person to teach that to someone else. If you know it off the back of your hand and you can't even remember how you learned it, you're the worst person to teach other people because you don't understand their perspective. It's like, if you've only just learned it, you still remember what it's like to not know that thing. So get up on a stage and tell people what you know. That would be my advice.
That's awesome advice. Thank you. Well, I have one follow-up to that question and then the last question for today. The follow-up to that question is, okay, so since you have so much experience, I know that you've been through everything from internet going out when you're about to come onto stage, I don't know, falling on stage maybe, things like that. So what's your advice to deal with when those things happen? What do you do?
Don't panic. I was giving a talk in Australia a couple of years ago and the lectern started to collapse as I was speaking. I was 5 minutes in and I had to hold bits of the lectern together until I could work out how to click two pieces into place to stop it from falling apart. And the audience, especially in the Python community, are wonderful. They're the most forgiving, welcoming, encouraging people. You know, they want you to succeed as a speaker. So if you have some technical problems, whatever you can do to work past them, you know, the audience will allow you to have many minutes without actually speaking and things like that. When you know, if your slides aren't showing up on the screen or something like that, when you eventually get things to work, you'll get a big round of applause. I mean, obviously, the stuff I'm saying now is like all stuff that happened in person rather than over a Zoom call. But people are great, and yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think it's just roll with it. It's not a big deal. If you're giving talks or if you're giving a lot of online conference things, it's bound to happen. We are all not exempt. One of the trickiest things to do actually is doing live coding demos. So if you're planning to do that, always have a backup plan. Because I've had awful experiences where literally the night before I absolutely destroyed my development environment. Next morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, I was trying to rerun, nothing worked. So having a video or something for those cases is always a good idea. But if you have problems like your battery died or your slides are not displaying or hopefully not a building is collapsing on top of you, you can pretty much roll with it and laugh about it. I try just to laugh about it, probably because it has happened way too much to me, but to just the community understands, people understand that that's how it happens.
I think it was the day that I met you actually, Tania. You were about to give a talk and the adapter for the computer didn't work, although it was an adapter for the Mac. The previous speaker ran all the time, so you're like extra time on the building already, and everyone the organizers are like, I have no idea what's going on, and you're like, no, this is grand. I'm gonna go to the car and get my adapter. I come back and see you in like 10 minutes. It's okay. So that was the day I met you. So that was quite impressive as well, because I was like literally ripping my hair off. I
wouldn't have been that calm.
You should have sweat my back. You should have seen my back sweating.
Oh, well, we don't get that part because we only look at the front of the speaker. That's it.
I know it sounds. I think it's always worth reassuring people that we have nerves too. I know people, the most experienced advocates that I know, some of them have prescribed tablets that they take before they go up on stage to stop their hands from shaking, because otherwise they can't keep the shaking out of the voice. I know at least 2 people who do that. I used to have a boss at my last job who will only wear dark coloured T-shirts and ideally more than one layer so that he doesn't show the sweat as he's kind of on stage and things like that. It's like even people who really are afraid of being on stage still do it because mainly I think from the rush at the end when you've finished and you've got that round of applause and everybody's, you feel like you did a good job.
Awesome. So, well, thank you very much. Martin, do you want to cut me off? Because I had one last question.
No, go on. You still have 2 minutes to go.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to take that time then, and I'm going to ask the both of you. So Python, object-oriented or functional programming?
Bit of both.
If you had to choose one, I would say object oriented.
Oh, I would choose functional if I had to choose one.
Thank you. Now go fight.
Okay, so I think that was a good way to close it all. Thank you very much for being on the panel, to just spend an extra hour with us. The things you told us were really interesting, especially for people who want to learn how to become a developer advocate themselves. So thanks again for that. And is there any last things you would like to say? Like,
Well,
Mark?
let's thank our speakers.
Let's
I'd like to thank our speakers, our panelists. Thank you very much, Martin, as well, for hosting us. And yeah, thank you for everyone that sent questions and that interacted. Now, if anyone else wants to say anything else, thanks a million.
If not, then let's just wave goodbye, and we'll see you shortly. So thank you very much again. And now, as you all know, Tania's employer, Microsoft, is sponsoring this. So to make those people happy, we'll just play a short ad, and then we will be back with the next scheduled talk.